April 3, 1953. A locked vault beneath CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Inside, a chemist mixes a colorless, odorless compound into a glass of water. He doesn't know the man who will drink it. He doesn't need to. His orders come from a program so classified that even its own director will later admit under oath that most of its records were destroyed on purpose. This is not fiction. This is the day the United States government begins dosing its own citizens with LSD, without their consent, without their knowledge, and without any intention of ever telling them. For decades, anyone who suggested this was happening would have been laughed out of the room, called paranoid, called a crank. But history has a habit of vindicating the paranoid. This is the story of the conspiracy theories that weren't theories at all. They were classified. The program they swore didn't exist. 1953. Sidney Gottlieb, 35, a chemist with a club foot and a stutter, runs the CIA's technical services staff. He is, by any normal measure, an unremarkable bureaucrat. But Gottlieb has just been handed. It wasn't an isolated secret. It was a symptom of something larger. An era where the machinery of national security had learned it could operate completely outside the public's view. And in the Pentagon, a far more explosive plan was already being drafted, one that wouldn't just experiment on Americans. It would consider sacrificing them. The plan to attack America, March 1962. 18 months before Gottlieb's experiments come to light, a document lands on the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, 45, a sharp, statistics-driven former Ford Motor Company executive, now running the American military. The document is titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It comes from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior military officers in the country. Its contents are staggering. The plan, known as Operation Northwoods, proposes staging fake terrorist attacks on American soil and blaming Fidel Castro's Cuba to manufacture public support for an invasion. Ideas on the table: blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay, hijacking planes, even possibly using real casualties, and pinning the blame on Cuban agents. One line from the plan reads plainly, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area." Another proposes sinking a boat of Cuban refugees at sea.
Afterward, anyone claiming the U.S. government had plotted to kill or endanger its own citizens for a war pretext would be dismissed as a lunatic fringe conspiracy theorist. But in 1997, the National Security Archive, a nonprofit research group, obtains the actual Northwoods documents through declassification requests. They are real. They are signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs himself. McNamara and President Kennedy reject the plan. It never leaves the drawing board. But the fact that it was drawn up at all, approved by the nation's top military brass, and sent up the chain for presidential sign-off, is enough to shatter any assumption that our government would never. It nearly did. And 2 years later, a strikingly similar tactic, a fabricated pretext for war, wouldn't stay in a drawer. It would be used. The incident that never happened, August 4th, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. The USS Maddox, a destroyer patrolling contested waters, radios in that it's under attack from North Vietnamese torpedo boats for a second time in 2 days. Sonar operators report torpedo sounds. Radar shows blips. Commander James Stockdale, 40, a Navy pilot flying overhead that night, later writes that he had the best seat in the house and saw no boats, no torpedoes, no wakes, nothing. But back in Washington, the story that reaches Congress is one of unprovoked, repeated attacks. Within days, President Lyndon Johnson uses the incident to push through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, a sweeping authorization that hands him the power to escalate American involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The vote passes the Senate 88-2. It is the legal trigger for a war that will eventually kill over 58,000 American service members and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians. For years, skeptics, including Stockdale himself, insist the second attack never happened. Pentagon officials deny it. But in 2005, an internal National Security Agency historical study is declassified. Its conclusion is blunt. The NSA had deliberately altered and mistranslated intercepted signals to make it appear an attack had occurred. The report states that SIGINT, signals intelligence, was not merely skewed, but knowingly manipulated. A war-triggering event manufactured, or at minimum, catastrophically exaggerated, by the very agency meant to report the truth. One misread sonar ping, one manipulated intelligence report, and a nation is at war. If that could happen in the open theater of a battlefield, what could happen quietly, in the shadows, against people who trusted the system entirely? The study that lasted 40 years, 1932 to 1972, Macon County, Alabama. The U.S. Public Health Service launches a study on 600 black men, 399 of them already infected with syphilis, under the promise of free health care. What the men are never told, they will not be treated. Even after penicillin becomes the standard, proven cure for syphilis in 1947, researchers withhold it deliberately so they can keep observing the disease's progression untreated until death. Eunice Rivers, a black nurse working within the program for nearly its entire duration, keeps the men returning for checkups, unaware or unwilling to confront that she is facilitating their harm. The study's own internal documents describe the men not as patients, but as subjects, reduced to data points in what researchers privately called the Tuskegee experiment. It runs for 40 years. 40 years while men suffer blindness, insanity, and death, and pass the untreated disease to wives and children. It is only stopped in 1972, not by an internal review, but because a public health service employee named Peter Buxton leaks the story to the press. The Associated Press publishes the expose, and the public outcry finally forces a shutdown. By then, at least 128 of the men have died directly from syphilis or
President Bill Clinton formally apologizes to the 8 remaining survivors in 1997, 25 years after the study ends, 65 years after it began. If the government could watch hundreds of its own citizens die of a curable disease for 4 decades and call it science, what else might it be watching? Not to heal, but simply to know. The War on the Movements, 1956 to 1971, J. Edgar Hoover, 61. The founding director of the FBI, has run the Bureau for over 3 decades by the mid-1960s, wielding influence that even presidents are wary to challenge. Under his direction, a program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, targets civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and black nationalist groups, not to prevent crimes, but to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize them, in the FBI's own internal wording. Martin Luther King Jr., 34 at the height of the surveillance, is wiretapped extensively. The FBI compiles recordings from his hotel rooms and sends him an anonymous letter, widely believed to be crafted by Hoover's own assistant, suggesting he take his own life to avoid public disgrace. It is one of the most chilling documents in American law enforcement history. For years, activists claim they're being watched, infiltrated, and sabotaged by federal agents. They are dismissed as paranoid radicals. But on March 8, 1971, a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI breaks into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and steals over 1,000 classified documents. Mailed anonymously to journalists, the files expose COINTELPRO to the public for the first time. The fallout is seismic. A Senate committee, led by Senator Frank Church, spends the next 4 years investigating. The 1976 Church Committee report confirms it all. Illegal surveillance, forged letters, infiltration of peaceful organizations, and yes, the plot against King. Hoover, protected for decades by his own mythology, is exposed only after his death in 1972, timed, almost cruelly, just 1 year after the break-in that doomed his legacy. But if the FBI could run a secret war against its own citizens for 15 years undetected, what happens when that surveillance stops being about political dissidents and becomes about everyone? The industry that knew, 1950s to 1990s. Internal memo, Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company, 1963. The company's own general counsel writes that we are, then, in the business of selling nicotine an addictive drug. This is not a whistleblower's claim. It is the tobacco industry's own lawyer admitting the truth in writing 30 years before the public would ever see it. For decades, cigarette companies publicly and repeatedly insist there is no proven link between smoking and cancer, even funding their own research bodies designed specifically to manufacture doubt. Executives from 7 major tobacco companies testify before Congress in 1994, each one stating under oath that they do not believe nicotine is addictive. But that same year, an anonymous package arrives at the office of Stanton Glantz, a University of California researcher. Thousands of pages of internal Brown and Williamson documents, leaked by a paralegal named Merrill Williams, who had photocopied them while working at the company's law firm. The documents prove the industry had known about nicotine's addictiveness and cancer risks since at least the 1950s, and had run a coordinated, decades-long campaign to suppress that knowledge. The fallout leads to the 1998 Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, in which the major tobacco companies agreed to pay states a combined $206 billion over 25 years. At the time, the largest civil litigation settlement in American history. Millions of Americans had smoked, and many had died, while the industry sat on proof of exactly what its product was doing to them. Corruption at that scale, sustained for 40 years by an entire industry. It would be almost unbelievable if it weren't about to happen again, this time not with a product, but with a phone in every pocket. The man who proved them all right. June 5, 2013, Hong Kong. A 29-year-old NSA contractor named Edward Snowden checks into the Mira Hotel with 4 laptops. His old life completely. For years, privacy advocates and journalists had warned that American intelligence agencies were secretly hoovering up the phone records and internet activity of ordinary citizens, not just suspected terrorists, but millions of Americans who had never been accused of anything. Officials had repeatedly denied it. In March 2013, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper is asked directly, under oath, before the Senate, whether the NSA collects data on millions of Americans. His answer, no, sir, not wittingly. It is a lie, and Snowden has the documents to prove it. Over the following days, journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras publish a series of stories built on Snowden's leaked files, revealing the existence of PRISM, a program allowing the NSA direct access to user data from Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple, and a bulk metadata collection program sweeping up the call records of virtually every Verizon customer in the country, under a secret court order that Americans were never permitted to know existed. The reaction is immediate and global. Clapper is forced to admit his Senate testimony was, in his words, clearly erroneous, the closest an intelligence chief gets to confessing he lied to Congress on live television. In 2015, a federal appeals court rules the NSA's bulk phone records program was illegal all along, unauthorized by the very law used to justify it for over a decade. Snowden is charged under the Espionage Act and lives in exile in Russia to this day. He calls the price he paid worth it, writing that he would rather be without a state than without a voice. The theory that the government was secretly watching its own citizens on a mass scale wasn't a theory anymore. It was federal court precedent. 6 stories, 6 moments where the label conspiracy theory was used to bury the truth, right up until leaked documents, whistleblowers, and declassified files dragged it into the light. Mind control, manufactured wars, deception that lasted generations, hidden behind the full authority of governments and corporations that swore, under oath, it wasn't happening. And history suggests this pattern doesn't end with Snowden. Somewhere right now, another file sits sealed in a vault, another program runs under a classified name, another whistleblower is deciding whether the truth is worth the life they'll lose telling it. The stories declassified so far are only the ones that got out. What hasn't surfaced yet?